Welcome. I am Josh Heumann. I'm the curator of education and public programs at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery in Toronto. Before we begin, I hope you will join me in acknowledging the history, culture, and stewardship of the land of this region's Indigenous people. Most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, a Mississauga Ojibwe First Nation. We know the lands within Canada with life-giving waters and life-sustaining air is contested territory, taken forcibly from the Indigenous who were victims of genocide and are still not treated equally within a nation-to-nation dynamic. My colleagues at the Power Plant and I strive to live in respect, peace, and right relations with them as we live and work upon their traditional territory. And we hope that you, our audience, will join us in this endeavor. The Power Plant, founded in 1987, is Canada's leading public art gallery devoted to the presentation of contemporary art, artists, and ideas through exhibitions, publications, talks, and events. With 3 seasons each year, fall, winter, and summer, the staff prepare and present exhibitions featuring emerging and established living artists. Exhibitions are often first solo exhibitions in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, or the world, and almost always include new work and series, often commissioned specifically for the occasion. They are often accompanied by publications that document and contextualize the artist and their work. And they are complemented by a wide range of public programs for visitors of all ages, now online through the ongoing pandemic. We are so pleased to be online with this conversation between artist Howie Tsui and exhibition curator Justine Kohleal, who will speak about the artist's work from the exhibition From Swelling Shadows, We Draw Our Bows. Before I introduce Howie and Justine, I am pleased to play video remarks from TD, a cherished supporter of the Power Plant and of Asian Heritage Month events all across Canada.
Hello, I'm Yuki Chung, Manager of Decision Support and Budget within TD's Global Corporate Citizenship team. Thanks for joining us here with the Power Plant Gallery. TD is proud to support the In Conversation event with Howie Tsui and Justine Kohleal, as well as the future Mega Imagine Cities, Toronto Urbanisms After Jane Jacobs event. May is Asian Heritage Month, a time to recognize the history, culture, and achievements of Asian communities in Canada whose contributions continue to foster growth and prosperity across the country. At TD, we recognize that diversity represents one of our greatest strengths because it helps create a more inclusive environment for the customers, colleagues, and communities we serve. That's why we've been supporting Asian customers, colleagues, and communities for over 30 years. As we witness the devastating effects of the pandemic and the subsequent acts of racism, TD stands with all Asian communities. During the month of May, we are supporting a series of Asian heritage celebrations such as this event today through the TD Ready Commitment or Global Corporate Citizenship platform. It is an opportunity to celebrate and learn about the many achievements and contributions of Canadians of Asian descent. Celebrate with us, albeit virtually, with your families and friends through the many initiatives happening this month and beyond. On behalf of TD, thank you and happy Asian Heritage Month. 多謝你嘅參與，祝你一個愉快嘅亞裔文化月。Thank you.
And thank you so much to TD for supporting this program and more at the Power Plant. So now, turning to this evening's program, or this afternoon's program. Howie Tsui was born in Hong Kong, raised in Lagos, Nigeria, and Thunder Bay, Ontario, and currently lives and works in Vancouver, Canada. He holds a BFA from the University of Waterloo. Recent solo exhibitions include the Ringling Museum of Art in Sarasota, Florida, 2020, the Burrard Arts Foundation, Vancouver, 2020, Ottawa Art Gallery, 2019, OCAT Museum in Xi'an, China, 2018, and Vancouver Art Gallery 2017. And select group exhibitions include the Asian Art Fair Paris in 2019, Art Labor in Shanghai 2015, Parasite Hong Kong 2014, and the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa 2014. Tsui received Canada Council's Joseph Stauffer Prize in 2005 and was longlisted for the Sobey Art Award in 2018. Justine Kohleal is assistant curator at the Power Plant, where she has curated a number of projects, including Howie Tsui from Swelling Shadows, We Draw Our Bows, Beth Stewart, Length, Breadth, Thickness, and Duration, and Thomas J. Price, Ordinary Men. Additionally, she has assisted with exhibitions featuring Shuvania Shuna, Ellen Gallagher, Vincent Meeson, and Nafuz Ramirez Figueroa. She worked previously on curatorial projects with Fringe Gallery, DC3 Art Projects, Evergreen Brickworks, Ryerson Image Center, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. Kohleal holds a BA from the University of Alberta with a focus in art, design, and visual culture, a curatorial MFA from OCAD University, and she interned with the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Luce Foundation Center and with public programs at the Art Gallery of Ontario. So please, at this time, welcome Howie and Justine.
Bloop. Hello.
Hi, Howie.
Hi. Hi,
How
Justine.
are you?
Good. You know, it's sunny here. I hear it's sunny over there, which is nice. Sunny everywhere.
Yeah, super sunny, finally, very hot. I'm loving it. Not gonna complain.
I can see a bead of sweat on your cheeks.
Oh gosh, no, it's supposed to be like a nice glow, not like a sweaty glow. Yeah, so I know we don't have like a ton of time to talk. So I guess we can maybe jump right into it if that's okay with you.
No, let's do it.
All right. So, the past couple in conversation programs that I've participated in or helped lead, I've always started by asking the artists how they've adjusted to being creative during COVID, just because I find the answers to be really varied and interesting. So I'm hoping that you don't mind if we start the same way. And I'm curious, how you found being creative during this difficult year and a bit.
Yeah. I think when it started, there was a lot of, definitely not much motivation to do anything creative, really. But I think I've been very fortunate and lucky that there's a lot of still projects coming my way or that I'm working on. So there's kind of a consistent rhythm of like whacking a mole. Like I got to keep on. So at least the motion, I'm running through the motions of normalcy that I'm doing work.
Right.
But I think the challenge, of course, is there's not that work and play balance. It's just work. You're not going out and doing any social stuff to celebrate achievements or sort of kind of dipping into the creative spark that you receive from going out, social engagements, random hangs. So
those connections that like bring out certain, creative faculties.
Yeah, it's like maybe you had a seed of an idea and then this conversation took it to another step, or that you can take it further. Now, a lot of the research or the creative process is very silo styles.
Yeah.
So I think that's challenging. But,
yeah,
and I think there's also the instance where you work really hard and make something you're really proud of and happy with, and then it kind of goes away and, maybe no one sees it. Maybe some people see it. So it kind of feels like a mirage, like it didn't happen sort of a thing.
Yeah, so it's a bit surreal. Yeah. And I kind of feel like, in some ways, like the exhibition at the Power Plant is a bit like that, because we worked so hard on it and it's amazing. It's an amazing exhibition, but it really was only open to the public for a couple months and then we had to close it and it's still unfortunately closed.
Yeah. I'm hoping it opens up for a couple months at the end, maybe. But
I hope so too. Yeah. I mean, right now it's still currently closed and we don't have any updates. Like I can't share any updates with you or the attendees at the moment, but fingers crossed that, things go
yeah,
back sort of semi to normal and we can open up for a little bit, like you say, because it really is such an incredible show. And I guess like in terms of this in conversation, it's nice that we can kind of focus on it a little bit. So people that have seen it or maybe haven't seen it will get like a bit of a taste of what the show is about and what it's like, because this is all we have right now. Zoom.
yeah.
Yeah, so I guess, if you want, do you want to start the PowerPoint and we can kind of
Oh yeah.
show some images and talk a little bit about the exhibition? And I did want to start by asking you about the title, because the title, which is, as Josh mentioned, From Swelling Shadows We Draw Our Bows, is probably your most, if not the most, one of your most poetic titles to date. But it also riffs off of a really interesting Chinese concept, which is yingxi. And I find that this is at the heart of this exhibition for sure, but also much of the work that you make. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the title and yingxi as well.
Yeah. It is the more kind of poetic title. And I think before, a lot of my titles seemed forced, like they were these like clunky, dense like word constructions, like jamming together two like words together. So I was trying to go for something more, had a cadence and was a little bit more musical. And then I was centered kind of on this concept of yingse in Cantonese, because I had read about the term through this New Yorker article about the martial arts fantasy fiction author Gam Yong or Jin Yong.
Mhm.
And most of the work in Retainers of Anarchy, most of the images are based on his stories, right? And then in this New Yorker article, it discusses what I had already kind of keyed in on when I, read his stories or watched his TV shows, is that there's this like kind of subtext in the work, and the term they used to describe it was yingse, which is shooting from the shadows. So it's almost like a oblique form of critique or subtextual messaging. And in a way, I kind of interpolated it as maybe that author's response to his work being censored in China, because the story goes is that this genre, martial arts fantasy fiction, the genre of fiction was censored in mainland China for a period of time during the Cultural Revolution. So he ended up moving to Hong Kong, where he started a newspaper company, which still exists now. And in order to sell copies of the newspaper, he wrote these martial arts stories in serialized forms, like weekly chapter release. And then everyone got super hooked on his stories. But in a way, a lot of these narratives are around, resistance and like marginalized groups finding some sort of collective power against a more authoritarian presence. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why I was kind of honing in on this idea of the shooting from the shadows. Yeah.
Yeah, and I liked to, I mean, obviously this is very present in Retainers of Anarchy, your kind of like seminal, huge animation that's in the exhibition. But it's also very present, just kind of this idea of being in the shadows and liminal spaces. I find like in the exhibition space itself, it's a very like, dark kind of space that you walk into. And then you're kind of transported into a completely different space when you walk out of that and into the Clara story, where the Power Plant had commissioned you to make this site-specific work in the Fleck Clara story. And it's this like, sweeping ceilings and very light and airy. And so, but I think that also within that, there's a lot of parallels between, or like complements between the work that you did in the Clara story and the work that is in the main exhibition space. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the Clara story work, how it came about, how it's made. I mean, I love that you put this GIF in here because you can see kind of like how you're creating the work, but talking about the process and like what it means essentially.
Yeah, the process came about by accident in a residency in Quebec, like in the mid-aughts or late, maybe 2008. And at that time, I was already working on a bunch of a series called Horror Fables, which was investigating this concept of fear, more grand versions of fear as the way it's implemented by governments or media to to control, like, I guess, a large group of people. And then I was also kind of differentiating that with how fear is like implemented by like parents to like keep their kids safe. Like they'll say some oddball folkloric things. So I was already kind of looking at ghosts in particular and ghost stories as a manifestation of fear. And then in this research around ghosts, most of these stories are always generated out of some sort of trauma, some sort of wrong that had happened in a certain site, and it haunts, or this negative energy kind of persists in the space where some sort of trauma occurred. And then when I was working on these ink drawings, I had just done these like loose gestural drawings, and it was late at night. And then weeks later, I removed the paper and it was stuck on the wall. And basically all the ink and paint had seeped through it. And when I removed it, my drawing was all ruined. But then I saw these faint marks, and maybe it was late at night, but I was seeing like visions. I was seeing things. So in a way, then I started trying to tease out the figures that I was seeing. And at first I was using like brush and ink, but then it looked too much of like the human hand. Like it didn't seem like an apparition. But then I had matches with me. So I started burning matches against the wall, and then it was able to kind of render out these figures in a more kind of ghostly or kind of just a magical way. So that's kind of how this process originally started, this practice. And the way I read it as, usually, when it happened, I kind of see the drawing as on the paper as like a metaphor for like the body. It's like all the energy was there. But then when you remove it from the wall, there's all that's left is like a trace or a spirit, and that's kind of the way they kind of function in the space, as like remnants or residue, residue of souls, right? That kind of occupy the space. So yeah, and then in kind of working with the Clara story space, it's way different than a lot of the other spaces I've done this similar work in.
Yeah.
All
it's
those
a
other
complicated space.
It's tight.
Yeah.
It's really symmetrical. So I was kind of reading it, the symmetry of it, and also how it's kind of in relation to the water and the sky. Like usually the spaces I do this in, they're just enclosed art boxes, right? So this has these, and I wanted the work to kind of respond to these kind of natural elements. So I did some research around like I was already interested in like feng shui like designs. This is like an install I did here in Vancouver at the Vancouver Art Gallery that's still up.
Yeah, beautiful.
But yeah, this is how I wanted to structure the way the work, the figures were in the space based on these two diagrams, right? The one on the top is the 9 halls diagram, and then the one on the bottom is like the Yellow River diagram. And they're like these kind of seminal designs that were later kind of informed like feng shui principles and like Chinese traditional medicine. So I kind of use these to kind of create a grid or a map to where I would locate the figures. And then there's the kind of addition of these like little incense, little groupings of incense that are kind of protruding out from the wall.
Yeah, and they match the certain points on the diagram, right?
Yeah, they're all on where the dot locations are. Yeah. So thanks to Vanessa for helping me with that. That was painstaking.
She's great.
Schematic work. But I was thinking it would provide like some order and balance. And maybe I'm getting old and the world feels super chaotic, and I'm like
Well, especially
gravitating.
this year.
Yes. So I'm like maybe gravitating towards like order, instead of before I would just kind of freestyle, just wing it on a wall. But I think with that space, I really wanted it to be really structured.
Yeah, and I think it works really well because it is a complicated space. It's difficult to work with because it's so symmetrical, as you say, and also so sweeping. So it's like this grand space, but also, yeah, very, very tight, very I don't know, hard to work in. And I like that there's this kind of tension there. And I think it's a tension that kind of runs through all of your work, really, in the show in particular, this tension between like order and chaos. And so you play with it really well here, because the figures are kind of agonized in a way, and they're maybe a bit more chaotic seeming, but they're really confined within this orderly grid, which is also then reflected in the space itself.
Yeah, the grid gives there's some jail vibes. There's some persecuted people's vibes, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think we had talked about it also as these figures kind of being perhaps like dissidents haunting the streets of Hong Kong, I think is what I wrote in the wall label anyway. So yeah, there's also that association with the other works as well.
Yeah, it's people that aren't physically there anymore, or they're disappeared, or
silenced even.
Silenced, locked up. I was thinking about that when I was designing some of the figures, how they look and stuff.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit. So now, you've touched upon like your history with horror, in a sense, like where some of that interest kind of came from. But I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about, what is, or how it's evolved, I guess, your interest in horror and ghosts, I suppose.
Yeah, I think in the past, like in the late, like 2009, when I was doing the kind of ghost stories, kind of focused work and monsters work, I think I was coming from a more like kind of impish and satirical place, like kind of disingenuous. And it was mostly like, using sarcasm or parody or exaggeration as a way to like disarm these like uneasy visions, or these like this cloud of paranoia that I maybe felt. So it's kind of like that old trick of using like humor to like disarm, a lot of issues. And so I think that worked back then. But now, everything seems really intense, and it seems like there's like, like a callus, like my sarcasm receptors have like a callus built on it. So even being, it doesn't really work as well anymore. So things are, I think, these kind of explorations of ghosts and horror is taking on more like psychological or internalized space. I think because at that time when I was doing these ghost stories, as I was saying, how these hauntings exist at sites of trauma, but they were like physical sites or spatial sites, environmental. But now I'm thinking more about trauma as it is impressed into DNA and how it can get inherited and passed down. So it's definitely has transported internally from an external environment.
And there's a lot of emerging scholarship and research, both speculative, maybe more science fiction based scholarship, and also scientific scholarship on that actual phenomenon of trauma being imprinted into people's DNA and actually being passed down. So, yeah,
that's why I think when I was trying to parse out why was I so paranoid, or I try to be cool, but like my mom's pretty paranoid. But I'm like, why is my mom's paranoid? Well, those are the living conditions that she existed in, and these things happened to them. Or, why is my dad like really quiet, and then when he sleeps, he screams at like soldiers? It's because he was a kid during World War II in Shanghai. And it's like, trying to figure all that out and how it gets like passed down or how it affects you or might affect my art making or my image making or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes making art is one of the, not the best way, because obviously therapy is very important, and like talking about these things and acknowledging them is very important, but it can be a way to kind of speak about these really difficult subjects that people maybe inherently know but don't have the words to describe, especially older generations, I think.
Yeah, it's an exorcism. It's
Mm-hmm.
like forensic work, like psychic forensic work, and exorcism is kind of the practice.
Yeah. In a way, these ghosts are like an exorcism, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about retainers of anarchy. Also,
Yeah. Where are we? Yes.
These are all great though.
I know. I was just to flip through them there during the ghost part, but I forgot.
That's okay. So I guess maybe it would be nice for people who haven't been able to see this or who maybe aren't familiar with this work and also what the work is depicting, if you could maybe talk a little bit about what people are seeing here. And then I kind of wanted to focus maybe first on the way that you blend this kind of fiction, fact, and nostalgia, particularly nostalgia for like the Kowloon Walled City, which is on the screen here, and also Hong Kong as well.
Yeah.
So, and then how you meld these things into like actual political commentary.
Yeah. Well, what we're looking at is, I guess, one of the shots of the work at the power plant, and it's more of a zoomed in view of the Kowloon Walled City, which is like an anchoring, I guess, urban structure in the work, which is mostly a landscape. I can go back to the first image, I think. That's the zoomed out view. But yeah, and then so I guess we're talking about how does nostalgia blend with the political. Yeah, and it all kind of began like, the political part wasn't intentional at first. It was more of like a response, but in a way, like it all started when I this work kind of was born when I went back to Hong Kong after not being there for 25 years. So I had this like head rush of like clarity that helped explain a lot of my tendencies when I make art and pictures, and this like, and I always show in these slides this image of like my parents' restaurant menu, because I think it's like an apt like metaphor for also my like art aesthetic, which is like super like small font and dense and like excessive and confusing and all that kind of stuff. And then it's also like fake Chinese food, so there's all this like kind of this idea of like a fabricated Asian identity
right
also involved in it. And then so yeah, when I went back to Hong Kong, I was noticing, I had all these like sensations. Like I took a shower and I remembered the smell of the shower water, like from like it really came back to me. Those are these long nostalgic.
So you were about 5 when you left, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I was like 6.
Yeah.
And then I went back in 2010 or something like that.
Wow. I love that you could still like, I mean, scent is just like such a powerful.
Scent is one of the most strongest. So that was like one of the strongest ones. But then it was like movement and like space and density, reflections, glass, and then also like microcosms. Like my work, I've always been interested in like dioramas and making these like like worlds. So I think this kind of answered, seeing the environment there answered why I had these tendencies, right? And then this is, also like probably can allude to how the Kowloon Walled City is structured in Retainers of Anarchy, like these idea of cells and blocks and little animated components within them. Then there's also like this theme of like confinement too, and like stacking and pressure. And then I loved, and then there's like the natural kind of cinematic aspect of the city, like everything. There's so many escalators when you travel through it. So there has like a natural cinematic tracking kind of experience as you navigate the space.
Yeah.
So I have that same kind of like kinetic interest and dynamic interest in my picture making. And that kind of has like a similar similarities to the zooming aspect of Retainers of Anarchy, like the way the camera kind of zooms and like moves around.
Definitely. Yeah.
And then in terms of, I guess, maybe how it formed the kind of political kind of backbone or the theme of the work, it was from seeing this kind of media work, the River of Wisdom, when I was there. It was like a World Expo creation, and it was like a animated version of this traditional Song Dynasty scroll.
It had debuted in Shanghai, is that right?
Yeah, it started in Shanghai, and this was the Hong Kong leg of the tour. And it wasn't like on my bucket list or anything. It was like my uncle was like, "Oh, I got tickets for this. You want to go see it?" It's like, sure. So I had no idea what I was going to see. But when I saw it, I was like, first pretty wowed because it was so big. It was like such a spectacle. It was like 18 projectors. And I was already working in this like destabilizing like scroll formats or old like Chinese, like classical Chinese art forms. So I was working also with magic lantern projectors, and I was playing with the idea of moving images, making my images move.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this gave me the kind of impetus to maybe look into creating something similar, at least formally. But then, my feeling of seeing this work was that it depicted a very socially harmonious society, very idealistic.
Yeah.
At that time, and as we know now in Hong Kong, it's very tense, and there's a lot of unease and uncertainty as to what society will be like post handover. So I think I kind of read it as a form of like soft messaging, soft power messaging. It's like, oh, it's a classical Chinese city, check the prosperity kind of a thing. But the undercurrent reality on the ground is a lot of people are feeling not so great that there's language restrictions or new language regulations with what language is taught in school, that the local language is getting displaced and erased. So I wanted to kind of figure a way to take that idea of order and idealism and social harmony and kind of disrupt it. And the perfect kind of punctuation mark for it was the Kowloon Walled City, which, if viewers don't know, is this kind of self-organized society that kind of formed. It was a very kind of organic structure. It was built on a fort, and it got built up slowly over time. But it was not governed by, the colonial British Hong Kong government at the time or the mainland Chinese government. It existed in this, gray area, liminal zone outside of both those governing bodies. So it was also an apt allegory for the martial arts universe. At the time, I was already, pivoting into the genre of martial arts fantasy fiction from ghost stories, because I tend to kind of move through genres. And in martial arts fantasy fiction, that universe or their world, the Gongwu, is also this kind of wild, wild west, lawless place where like codes of ethics are just kind of self-generated. Usually it's like the wild, wild west kind of a thing. Yeah. So that's why I kind of used the Kowloon Walled City as kind of an avatar for this kind of liminal space that reflects both like Hong Kong's identity as both a British colonial space and then a, Southern Chinese space, cultural space. It could also serve as an allegory for the shifting nature of identity that's inherent to kind of diasporic experience, kind of shifting identity. So
Yeah.
I kind of like that, using that site.
Yeah, and it was a really interesting space too, in the sense that so many different businesses and people kind of coexisted in a way that I think, like we've talked about it before, in this kind of way that was both harmonious and not, but had its own kind of internal logic, which is very much like reflected in the way that your animation is structured too, because it also has its own internal logic, being an algorithmic animation.
Yes, I think that was the sweet spot once the work was able to formally address these ideas of order and chaos. Because I wanted, I put the Kowloon Walled City in the work because I wanted to raise questions of if a self-organized society could be more socially harmonious than a top-down governmental kind of authoritarian structure, right? Kind of raising these questions. And then formally the work, I work with a really talented media artist, Remy Siu, and he had suggested, instead of having the work run on a loop, where it was like the one from the World Expo, which was like 4-minute loop, consistent, why don't I could maybe program it so it's more randomized and ran on an algorithm. So basically the way the work functions is that the camera kind of moves around at its own logic, and then focus on various different parts of this sprawling animation, so that every time you watch it, you'll get a different sequence of you'll see a different sequence of animations and camera positions.
Yeah, and in that sense, it's really mesmerizing. Like you do kind of lose track of time, honestly. I spent a lot of time sitting in front of it, and kind of, it's almost as if you're in a trance. You kind of like wake up at a certain point, because you do this really great thing with the soundtrack, with the music, where it's quiet and then it swells and then gets quiet again. So it'll jolt you kind of awake, so to speak, at different points, but you really get lulled by this kind of like free flowing sequence of events that just unfolds in front of your eyes in this kind of like really organic, seemingly organic way.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the the really interesting thing about the work, because I usually like work that you can spend a lot of time with. Like, I'm not a huge fan of like the one-liner. It's like what one-liner type of work. So I think the work formally kind of accomplishes that goal of have like deep watching, or that it'll suck you in, sort of a thing, right? Yeah.
It does. And it's hard to do, I think, because not only are people's attention spans getting shorter with social media and all the devices that we have, but just on average, I don't think people spend a lot of time with art. They say it's like, what, three seconds or something per piece. But this really kind of doesn't even force you. It just like really sucks you in like a moth to a flame.
Yeah. And I think once viewers also know that it's maybe not linear, it's non-linear, then they kind of stick around longer, because they're like, oh, I can see something over there, will the camera bring me in there? So sometimes people stick around because they want to see where the camera goes, and if it'll take them where they haven't seen yet, but they know they can see something twitching like in the distance.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I also kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the similarities or the parallels between the Kowloon Walled City and Vancouver's Chinatown as well, because the Kowloon Walled City was demolished in 1994. And I think, a lot of major cities across North America, I mean, it was demolished in 94, I should say, to kind of make way for this more sanitized park/apartment space. So like there's a little ode or like memorial to the walled city, but it doesn't, the structure as we see it in these images like doesn't exist anymore. And a lot of places in North America and around the world really have used kind of urban development to gentrify some of their more like quote unquote unruly spaces. So when I was doing a bit of research into this, I found that you were kind of making retainers, which took you a very long time. It's not like it happened overnight, but within the time span that you were making Retainers of Anarchy, Vancouver's Chinatown neighborhood was also being, kind of threatened by developers that wanted to very aggressively like turn it into a series of condos and high rises. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that relationship, and also if you feel, that sometimes, I guess what I want to say is that when I was doing research into your work, a lot of people write about it as a questioning of the Chinese government, right? And like the relationship to mainland China and Hong Kong. But there's also, I think, a lot that you're saying about Canada's relationship, and maybe specifically British Columbia's relationship to the Chinese diasporic community as well. And I don't know if that gets touched upon as much. So I'm curious as to your thoughts about how your work is kind of received in Canada, and if you find that people shy away from that aspect a little bit more.
Yeah, like I had intended for the Kowloon Walled City to also serve as an avatar for the self-organized societies that emerged in North America and Chinatowns, and was hoping that maybe people would talk about, some of the policies or the conditions that were established to lead to these kind of ethnic enclaves, where collective organizing was required to develop a local economy or to preserve a certain, diasporic culture, or for security purposes. If you think about Chinatown in Vancouver historically. So I was hoping that maybe that would get touched, that this, the way the Kowloon Walled City formed was refugees fleeing, the Cultural Revolution in mainland China, and not being able to afford rents in Hong Kong. So that they kind of found that place as an affordable kind of solution. That very much mirrors how Chinatowns were formed, where, after the railroad, there wasn't much, Canada didn't have much use really for Chinese laborers as much. So they kind of formed this economy, doing things like laundry and restaurants, kind of servants, kind of servy, kind of what was traditionally at the time, I guess, feminine duties, female duties. But, my work previously, like before Retainers of Anarchy, I was concerned about kind of the brush of homogenization that was painted on Asian bodies in Canadian history. Because when I did research, for projects here and for Vancouver's Chinatown, all the history books, it's just like Asian people, Chinese Canadians, they're kind of this faceless, nondescript labor force.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why in my other works addressing this homogeneity brush was to, invent and depict these fantastical, very unique characters, hybridized creatures and otherworldly figures and stuff like that. And they were derived from this book, Classics of Mountain and Seas, a Chinese kind of cosmology book. And it kind of documents, like fictionally, fantastically documents this wide species, this taxonomy of creatures and peoples with very unique backwards feet and like split tongues and kind of fish hybrids, or, this guy has 3 heads. So I was like using these kind of otherworldly, like hybrid and fantastical figures to kind of speak to and respond to this nondescript brush that Asian bodies get painted. Even just because I'm familiar with, other Asian cultures and their food cultures and stuff like that, and their language, it's too bad. It sucks that, there's a lot of people that don't make the effort to differentiate one or the other, or that we have all very distinct and different histories, Asian cultures. So I think that's how I would talk about that.
Yeah. And I guess this kind of leads me to my next question a little bit, which is I did want to talk about your newest work, Parallax Chambers, which you started in 2018 and is ongoing. Oh, is there a clip you want to play?
I'm going to play it and hopefully it's muted.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yes. So here, this is Parallax. And, you know, you've talked a lot about propaganda and the pitfalls of monoculturalism in all of your work, I would say, or most of your work. And I feel like you're kind of expanding that critique that you started maybe with Retainers of Anarchy in the first animation, but by going inwards with Parallax Chambers. So it's like you're expanding this critique. Maybe the critique is getting a little bit more pointed, a little bit sharper, but it's by going like actually literally inwards into the walled city. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about this work, not necessarily only in those terms, but, you know, thinking about, oh, that's a scene I haven't seen before.
I know, this is the new one.
Oh, nice. Okay, there you go.
It broke open there. We left a crack.
That's great. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, this is the new capture version before it got sent off to Hong Kong.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you're thinking about how Parallax functions regarding homogenizing forces?
Homogenizing, yeah, exactly. I feel like, so we kind of talked about Parallax as a bit of a sequel to Retainers of Anarchy, although it is quite different also, but it's taking a lot of the same, it's taking the Caldwell Walled City and a lot of the same characters and kind of focusing in on the individual rooms within the walled city, and then therefore kind of expanding, I guess, that critique of monoculturalism or homogeneity or propaganda, the use of propaganda by, I mean, not just the Chinese government, but all governments really. But it does so in this way that it's like, it's a focusing in on it in order to expand outwards even further. So I'm curious about that tactic.
For me, it wasn't so much like Parallax to me isn't so much like it's like a critique as much as it's more of a refraction of psychological state. So from the years that I made Retainers to the current time, or when this started, and the duration, because it's ongoing and everything that's been happening, in a way, for me, it's like a document of some of the pressures or the psychological state that's being experienced by maybe a lot of citizens there. So that's why maybe there's a lot of images of people restrained, and then that's why things are always framed in a box and like interrogation room cells. And
there's a lot more violence, like pointed violence, I would say, too, in this particular one.
Yeah, I think things got really dark in 2019. Things got really dark, and that was before the pandemic. It was like, I think I was having difficulty like processing everything that was transpiring over there, and how it felt like, you know, it was disappearing, or it was going to be lost, or it is lost. So in a way, you know, Parallax is more of like, it's more dire. Maybe that's why it's more violent. More violent things happened. It's more dire. It's darker. So it's really a reflection of that psychological state of that place changing, you know. Because I had all these like romantic ideas of like, you know, bringing my kids there and like, yo, this is what it's about, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Still can do that, but it's just a different. It'll be different. It's place.
It'll be different. And then with the pandemic, it couldn't happen either, and you don't, maybe not sure when it can happen. So there's that kind of loss there too. There's this weird loss feeling of something gone, something. I mean, I don't want to like leave it on this kind of note necessarily, but I am aware of the time. And so I did want to open up the floor to our participants or our audience.
Yes.
just to see if there's any questions that people want to ask you. Yeah, so I would invite everyone to start, asking questions in the chat if they like. And maybe while we're waiting for some questions to roll in, I could ask you a slightly more lighthearted question, which is, I'm curious if you have any plans or have thought about maybe digitizing your drawing practice, because what we're seeing with Parallax Chambers and Retainers of Anarchy are like hand painted cells, right?
Yeah.
That are then, transferred to the digital realm, but everything is hand painted. And so I'm curious if that's crossed your mind or if that's something that you would ever consider doing.
I tried using those digital pens and pads and stuff, but they never felt right. Like they were too like glassy and like slippery. And I know you can put paper or something in between it, but then you can't see exactly where you're drawing. Then you're drawing and then you're looking over there. So it feels kind of alien to me. So I'm probably so old school that I won't give up the analog, because I don't know. There's something about like a toothiness or a grittiness or like a material quality in the drawings that I like to preserve. The other, it's way more work, and then it's also way more like expensive as a file size and all that kind of stuff, and for processing.
Like to do the hand
yeah,
drawing.
even for it, when it gets loaded into the program, it's just way more work for a computer to move that number of pixels around, unique pixels.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I just don't want things to look very like corporate or something, like commercial.
Yeah.
Like,
which I guess was one of the issues with River of Wisdom, right? That it was like this very corporate kind of product.
Yeah. It wasn't. Yeah, it had no grit.
No grit.
No grit.
Yeah. I'm just trying to see if we have any. Oh, here it is. No questions.
There's like only 4 people.
I know. Which we're very grateful for the 4 people to joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if there's no questions, then we can. Oh, maybe I'll ask you one more, Howie, if that's okay. Which is, maybe this is such a cliche question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What is inspiring you lately? I see your fish tank behind you, so
that's it. That's it. I think aquascaping, I'm like, there's a bunch of stuff. Like I've been working on some other projects involving these Scala Rocks. Well, my fish tank has these similar kind of anthropomorphic rocks. So I'm working on some projects where I'm trying to like blend Scala Rocks with these like die-cast robots that I also kind of grew up with. So this is all within that same formative years. So the same time I was watching martial arts fantasy fiction TV shows was the same time I was playing with these robots that were made in Japan, but they were super popular in Hong Kong in the 80s. And they were these like fetish objects. Like I remember getting super jealous because my dad got my cousin one for his birthday. And I was like, oh my God. But I have a bunch of them. And then I'm trying to meld it with these Scala Rocks. And the interesting thing about the Scala Rocks from my research is, the value of them, or the mythos behind them, is that they're these really cool shapes that are formed by nature exclusively. But then through the research, I find a lot of the cultivation practices around them involve a lot of, human tooling to like refine the shape or get the form that makes them more valuable.
Right. Yeah, of course.
But then there's this process of concealment where you put the rock in a river for like 10 years so it could naturally erode away the marks of the human hand.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's like the birth of like counterfeit culture, or like knockoffs and stuff like that. So I'm kind of messing around with that. And the aquascaping game, I'm like, my pandemic hobby was aquascaping. So
what is aquascaping?
It's like essentially a fish tank, but the emphasis is not on fish. It's on the the environment, the picture space, I guess.
Mhm.
Fish play a part in it, but it's about all those things. So there's this guy, this master of modern aquascaping is this guy Takashi Amano, who passed away kind of like I think in the 90s or 80s. But he came up with the idea of incorporating CO2 into fish tanks. And I think he just used soda water or something. He came up with that idea. And once you put CO2 in a fish tank, then the plants do way better. They grow way better because they absorb CO2 combined with
Right.
the light. Then you get really lush plants and stuff like that. So that's
Oh,
what
and I see. And this image that you're showing, this is underwater. This
this
floating island.
I have no idea how you did that one. I just quickly copy and pasted that from
Wow, that's wild. It looks like a painting, like it doesn't look like a real thing.
Yeah, but if you go on YouTube and Google like aquascaping, there'll be all these super high res, like fancy, really nice videos, and they're super like meditative and transportative. Like, that's the thing about parallax chambers and retainers is like this idea of portals, right? Or transportation, right? So I think this aquascaping thing is still in that vein of escape, I guess, or some sort of transportation or world creation. It's a nice low stakes. It's a low stakes world building because it's not for art right now. So it's just, I can still exercise my same muscles, like use little tweezers and little dexterity tools and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and exercise your creative muscles as well.
Yes, and then I'm learning all this biology stuff, all this like science stuff. So
that's very cool.
Yeah.
I imagine that it's also very relaxing, which is needed at this moment in time.
Yeah, it's like, I need to stare at the aquarium for 15 minutes. Like, that's kind of the thing. It's like, time to stare at the aquarium for 15 minutes. It's just like,
yeah. We actually do have 2 questions.
Nice.
So I'll read them to you. So Sarah is asking, she says, hello. She wants you to speak about navigating the shift between 2 and 3 dimensions, if there's time, which there is. It's totally fine.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah, I went to school with. We're both graduates of UW, University of Waterloo program. Yeah, Sarah. Navigating the shift between 2 and 3 dimensions. I am still like, I generally am working in two dimensions. And then, with this digital stuff, I've been starting to mess around with like 3D modeling, even though those programs are super complicated, like all the functions and stuff. I really enjoyed making that sculpture. I don't know if you know, there's a sound sculpture I made, which was like a martial arts kung fu dummy, but it makes like polyrhythmic percussive knocking sounds based on motion sensors. I really enjoyed that. But the practical answer probably to Sarah Jane is that I live in Vancouver and there's like not much space. And so if you make sculptures, then you have to probably figure a way to store sculptures or 3D objects. And that could fill up a studio really quickly if you don't have like a way to get rid of them or, share them to a collection. So that's a limit. That's a bit of limitation. But I'm interested in 3D space, but it seems extravagant as something to pursue like more deeply.
You also did a performance for Power Up last year, which was like our virtual fundraiser with was it a bonsai?
Yeah, it was a Japanese maple bonsai.
Yes, which is kind of a sculptural practice as well.
It is, yeah. I guess maybe these hobbies is how I'm like exercising my desire to do 3D, but then I rarely make a 3D like artwork that is intended to go into a gallery or something like that. But
maybe it's nice to have these things just for yourself and not have to feel pressure to share them too widely,
Yeah.
And then Alex Gregory has not a question, but he says that he saw the show and it's amazing. He stayed in the room watching the animations for a crazy amount of time as well. And the experience of walking through the corridor is almost an out-of-body experience, because you're so close to the art at the bottom, but also so far from the work at the ceiling, like at the top of the wall, which is a really lovely compliment, I think. Thank you, Alex.
It'd be so good to, we can end on that positive note. I haven't been
Yeah.
able to hear too many kind of impressions of their experience with the show at the power plant. So that's really good, really awesome and energizing to hear.
Yeah, that's really great. Well, I'll turn it back over to Josh for some closing remarks, but thank you so much, Howie, for joining me. It was such a pleasure to talk to you and to work with you on this exhibition. It was a really great experience.
Likewise, let's do it again.
Excellent.
Perfect,
Well,
yes, I'm
I
there.
will say thank you both. Thank you, Howie, for sharing so much more perspective about the works that the power plant has had great fortune to exhibit, although of course that exhibition cut a little short by the pandemic. Thank you so much, Justine, for leading this conversation with Howie. And thank you to the audience who has joined us. We have another program sort of very much following on the heels of this conversation. Next Thursday, also at 6 p.m., also including Howie Tsui in the conversation. The program titled Hong Kong is a Loaded Term, Megacities, Temporary Cities, Future Cities. That program comes to the power plant, I'll say, with thanks to critic and curator Godfrey Leung in Vancouver, and artist Christopher Ho, based in New York right now. And in addition to Howie Tsui as a panelist, we'll have Aiwa Ong and Don Chan, two really equally amazing voices, along with Howie, to think about how cities come together, how they grow, how sometimes their growth is unfettered and can't always be planned for, and so on. Thank you once again to TD for supporting not only this evening's program, but also next Thursday's program. And of course, I will say happy Asian Heritage Month. So please go out and be supportive of all Asian cultures, but I will say especially our Chinese community, who unfortunately during this time of pandemic have experienced increased discrimination, which is really just unfortunate and uncalled for. So once again, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.